Hey guys, it's Oz, and welcome back to Outroads. What a conversation I have for you today. This time, we dive headlong down a rabbit hole of modern socio-economics. Yeah, it's a big word, but believe me, Romain Wacziarg makes it more than palatable. He makes it exciting. It's a heady brew. We talk cultural divides between races and genders, contrasting fertility rates between the secular and the religious, and then, of course, a hefty dose of mountaineering. For Romain, though few of his students know it, is as accomplished in the mountains as he is in the classroom. Let's get into it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I grew up here.
How old is your daughter? You said 8.
She's 8.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mine's 10.
You have just one child?
We have 3, but the 2 older ones are off to college, and the little one
Oh, wow.
is 9 years younger than her brother.
Was that a surprise?
Well, it was. She's adopted. The other 2 are not. Were not. So,
It's hard to have a surprise adopted child.
Yeah. She was very much wanted. And we were a bit past the age limit, past the sell-by date.
Oh, do they have a cutoff for adoption where they want the parents to be?
No. We were past the
Just in
time we
terms
could
of-
have a biological child.
What was that like? I mean, I can't imagine, because she's 8 now. I feel like I got through the fire and we can do things with her. The relationship is completely different. You know, she's making jokes that crack me up. We can have intellectual discourse.
Yeah.
But, and I've heard other men say this, I hate to make these broad gender stereotypes, but the first year and a half there was less of a connection than I anticipated. Obviously, I loved the idea that this was my child, but it was this constant battle between it was like a battle of attrition. I was just trying to survive it. And then by 2, we really started to connect, and
That's
it's just
been
flourished.
exactly my experience.
Has it?
Yeah.
So what's it like having gotten through that and having a second go around?
I mean, it's the same.
Same?
I think it wasn't that thrilling the first 2 years.
Yeah.
And then it becomes better and better. And especially with girls and fathers. Kids could be born at year 2. That would be.
Wouldn't that be great?
It would be
Can't
great.
they just gestate another 2
Why
years?
do we need to go through all this stuff?
Yeah. Well, I mean, doesn't most of the animal kingdom, they're born able to walk and feed themselves.
Yeah.
I don't know why we got it wrong. We should have taken notes.
The size of the brain, that's what.
Oh, it's just that it won't fit through the birth canal?
Yeah, I think so. It's the brain size, and so they need to be born little, something like that.
But you could think in evolution, instead of the birth rate getting earlier and earlier, perhaps the female anatomy would expand to accommodate a larger cranium.
Yeah, you would imagine.
Yeah.
Well, it kind of did.
This is such a man idea.
It did a little bit.
It's like, did it? Yeah.
Well,
but not
broader,
enough.
Broader.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember my daughter spent the first, I don't remember how many days, 4 or 5 days in the NICU. So there was really the sense of her, she wasn't premature, but it had the same feeling where, it was a little dicey, and she's hooked up on tubes, and it felt like she was born too soon. She wasn't prepared because it was so unstable for a while. And it's the same feeling adults of premature children get. But in general, when the kid's born, it's very, it's precarious for a while.
Yes.
Yeah.
You do have these anxieties, about the kid turning around and suffocating during the night.
Yeah. I remember we learned no pillows in the crib.
Yeah, things like that. Don't put them on their bellies.
Right.
Well, the safety issues with kids when you take them mountaineering, it's visceral almost. Like I can go with a climbing partner and you can stand next to a cliff and you don't care because it's
his responsibility.
It's his responsibility. But when it's your kid standing next to a cliff, it's terrifying. Even when they're older. So last year I went to try the east face of Whitney with Simon.
Is that your son?
Yeah, he's
How old
19.
was he? 19.
Well, he's 19 now.
Is this the one you wrote about where someone had died just like the day before?
Well, yes, there were these 2 snowboarders.
Yeah, I remember reading. Yeah.
Wanting to snowboard the Mountaineers route, and they went and tagged the summit and fell off the north face. And we didn't climb the east face because it was icy, it turns out, but we got to the base, and there's this, I don't know if you've ever been that place, but it's like,
I haven't.
You basically, the east face starts by going up a right-leaning ramp, well, actually left-leaning ramp, but a ramp. And so, and you've got the bottom of the east face that drops out like this. And so you're sitting on a little ledge, and you've got the whole thing going like that. And he was sitting right on that ledge, and he started to take his shoes off and put them on the side. And
how deep is the ledge? You're talking like,
the size of this table.
Okay, so it's
but
more of a head game than
and then
a
he
real.
put his shoes right next to the edge of the thing. And if you elbow your shoes, that's it. We're toast. You're walking down the snow in your rock shoes.
That's a good point. If the shoes go, it's almost as bad as him going. I mean, what are you going to do?
But then also him. I was like, maybe I should have built an anchor here. So I did.
Yeah.
I built an anchor. I anchored him in and I said, hey, watch your shoes. Don't throw your shoes down the cliff.
Yeah.
So started leading the first pitch, and then I saw the ice, and I'm like, no.
Which do you think is the more accurate risk assessment, the one you have for yourself or the one you have for your child? Because one of the two is exaggerated in one direction or the other. Either we don't take our own safety seriously enough, or we're just hypersensitive to our children. But they can't both be accurate, right?
The one for yourself.
You do think it's more accurate?
It's just an anxiety you have.
Well, I'd imagine you're looking at the potential unraveling of your entire life philosophy. If your kid gets hurt doing what you've given a chunk of your life to, it's all proven wrong in a way, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, let's back up a minute. I mean, I have 1,000 mountaineering questions I'd love to ask you.
How do you do this?
We're rolling.
Yeah, we're rolling. I know, but you rearrange it. There's parts that you edit out, or
I mean, if you say something egregiously offensive, I can edit it out. But
I try not to do that.
I'd like to do as little editing as possible.
I try to keep my cushy job.
I won't.
Try not to say anything.
I won't threaten your tenure, Roman.
Nor do I want to say anything.
Yeah, you seem like an inoffensive guy.
Yeah, I'm not really.
But it's a great place to air your grievances on the world if you choose to.
Okay.
But one of the reasons I was really excited to talk to you, as I said, I met you at the SPS banquet, which for those that don't know is like a convention for Sierra-oriented mountaineers. And I had already been familiar with your trip reports. What I didn't know was that you were an economist, working at UCLA. We have a mutual friend, Pierre Well, who you work with. Yes. Yeah. And then I started to dig into, and I already was excited by that dichotomy because especially this era, a lot of kids growing up in the outdoors, whether they're climbers or snowboarders, that kind of shapes the whole of their identity. Perhaps later they diversify, but you see a lot of stories where that's the whole of them. So it's great to meet people who have these seemingly incompatible sides. They clearly balance one another. And I started to look into your history, and I thought it was very interesting. Correct me if I'm wrong. You were born in Switzerland, but then you were raised both in India and Paris. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you tell me what the time frame looked like? Because that's already a broad spectrum.
It was all driven by my father, who was a sort of wandering Jew. He was always all over the world. He grew up he was born in Cuba. Grew up in Morocco, France, England, Brazil, Mexico, all over the world. And he was always looking for his final destination. And in the 60s, late 60s, the big thing was all the hippies were going to India.
Okay.
And they were going to Goa and,
for spiritual enlightenment?
Yeah, spiritual enlightenment
and free drugs.
And abusing substances too.
Of course.
Substance abuse and spiritual enlightenment. And he was into neither of these things. But everyone was going to India, so he followed one of his friends and went on a trip in 1969 and fell in love with the country, and then looked for a job. And he was a serious guy, so he got a job in the French diplomatic service in Bombay, which is now called Mumbai. Mm-hmm. And in the early 70s, there were no relations between France and Bombay. Like, he was in the consular service taking care of commercial relations, and there were no commercial relations to speak of. The only issue affecting diplomats in Bombay in 1970 were sort of hippies getting in trouble in Goa and having to be repatriated back to France, because they ran out of money or they got in trouble with the law or whatever. So that's a lot of what he was doing as a young 28-year-old diplomat in India. So on his way there, he got a job with a ad agency in Geneva. So I was born in Geneva by complete coincidence, because he had this sort of temporary gig.
But that's great because you become a citizen, right?
No, you can't become a citizen. They don't make it that easy. And I never lived in Switzerland.
Being born in Switzerland? Oh, that's too bad.
So we lived in India for the first 6.5 years of my life.
Were you raised speaking French in India?
French, English, Hindi. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
We had the whole thing. He moved to New Delhi after a few years, worked for a French bank, BNP. And then he stayed on. He made his whole life in India. Passed away about 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago now, almost 11 years ago, and in India.
Did you continue to go back, I assume, to visit him? And you have deep roots there.
Yeah, I do. And some of my mountaineering came from that, because when I was 19, one of my sort of early outdoor trips, like long distance, was a trek in Ladakh in northern India. And with two friends, we were absolutely clueless. We just grabbed some backpacks, and went and crossed all of Ladakh by foot for 19 days.
Oh.
It was a 19-night, 20-day, I guess, trip.
That's tremendous.
And you know, 19 years old, like we really didn't know what we were doing. And but it was great. We had a fantastic time. I lost about 15 pounds, I think. When my father saw me, he thought I needed to be brought to the hospital, or I didn't. I just needed to eat.
Right.
And really character-forming experience to do that. That got me into at least outdoor activities, not at the time climbing, but definitely.
So it's not a mountainous region you were traversing there?
It was very mountainous, but it didn't involve climbing. There was a trail the whole way. You know, we were following basically the place has very little water, very little arable land. So basically the farmers cultivate little strips of land along the rivers that go down from high passes. And you have to go over several high passes to get into these little valleys where they have these tiny strips of land, and it's not enough. A single valley is not enough to support the population lives there. So they have to constantly be going from one to the other to open irrigation, take care of their fields, and then, you know, go back to their little villages in the middle there. And so that trek, you know, basically connected all these little villages of Ladakh across a number of high passes, maybe 5 or 6 passes that would be around 16, 17,000 feet high passes, like really, you know, tall. And so we took our time. I think probably a trek you could probably do in 10 days or something. We took 19. We spent, you know, multiple nights in the same location just to enjoy the place. Took our time, and that trip report's also on my.
Is it
on my website? It's you have to go back to the 1989 you know, date, so you have to scroll down a long way.
The inception point.
Yeah, I think it's actually not a trip report. It's just the pictures, but they're you know, 1989 in Ladakh. It was really before the modernization of India, and it really felt like old style Tibet. You know, it's culturally part of Tibetan culture, but it, for some accident of history, didn't end up being you know, inside the territory that China grabbed.
Do you remember what it was like after 19 days? I assume your mind's blown wide open. It's your first experience with like backcountry travel, coming back to Mumbai or Bombay at the time. I don't know.
No, it was Delhi at the time. My dad had moved to Delhi.
Was there a reintegration struggle at all? Or were you felt like you knew what you wanted to do with your life?
Well, we were 19. So the first thing is that it really is striking when you do a trip that long, you really end up forgetting everything. The first week, you're sort of obsessed with the comforts, and especially when it's the first time you do this. You know, I think my longest trip prior to that was a 2-night outdoor trip. And first week, you sort of, you know, feel you miss things. And then after a while, you just forget everything. You're just focused on what you're doing daily, you know, your sort of menial tasks of cooking and sleeping, going
Survival.
to the bathroom, getting a few miles in that day, you know. And so when you get back to civilization, it's like I actually felt when we saw the road and there was a truck barreling down the road, depressed. Like, this was not, you know, you were lost and you were happy being lost.
But at the same time, it didn't derail you from pursuing academia and going to college and having a more, you know, on the grid, predictable sort of lifestyle.
No, it didn't. I think it caused me to become passionate about the outdoors. Yeah, but it didn't cause me to abandon my ambitions. At the time, I was like not really into. I was already into economics, but I was not into pursuing an academic career. That came later. I was in college, and in France we have this parallel system of universities called the Grande École. I was in that sort of frame of mind, and typically what that leads to is higher administration. The most prestigious jobs in France tend to be in government. And then my sort of attempt to get into the French higher administration didn't pan out, and I got an opportunity to come to the U.S.
You went to, was it Stanford first or Harvard?
No, I went to Harvard. I had this first, the first experience was a 1-year exchange program that my college had. And so it was sort of like one of the years of my French PhD spent, you know, in the U.S. But I loved it, and I applied for the program, and they took me, and so I stayed on and ended up transferring.
Did you imagine you might spend the rest of your life in the U.S. at that time?
Yeah, I mean, at that point, once I was there and I was in the PhD program, and I think it became very clear. the gulf in terms of the quality of life for academics between France and the US is still today enormous. So you have a much better life as an academic in the US than you do in France. Materially, but more importantly, I think in terms of the support that is brought, both teaching and research are much more valued and well-resourced here. One of the other very important milestones was meeting my thesis advisor, whose name was Alberto Alesina, who passed away 4 years ago, fortunately. But Alberto was a mountaineer and a skier. And he's really the one who introduced me to climbing.
Kindred soul.
Yeah, well, I was his PhD student, and we became good friends as I was progressing through the program. And he ended up supervising my thesis. And on weekends, he would say, let's go climbing in New Hampshire. And he was Italian, and the tradition in the Alps is always to go with guides. So we would always have guides. And so I had a very good sort of training initially with, a guide in North Conway, New Hampshire. We would go, in the summer to Cathedral Ledge to rock climb. In the winter, we would go also to North Conway and do some ice climbing. And
wow.
So he really introduced me to rock climbing.
It's great to have a role model to show you how these parallel paths can coexist, right?
Yeah, definitely. And it's exactly right. He had these dual passions. I mean, he was really more of a skier than a climber. But in the winter, he would go and he would try to arrange his teaching so it didn't have to occur in the winter, so he could go skiing. And then he
have you emulated that?
No, I think he was extremely productive, and he was able to arrange things so that he would come back from a day of skiing and still be able to put in a whole day of work somehow.
No, but I know that you spend some big seasons in the Sierra. I looked at. I mean, I want to talk about your economical papers. I found them fascinating, but in terms of the mountaineering, I remember I looked, and you did last season. You did something like 4 days solo, doing Finger Peak and is it Rhinestein?
Yeah.
And then you had 4 days off, and then you jumped in for 6 days of like Cloud Canyon adjacent.
Yes.
Which is an area that Phil Arnott writes about.
Yes.
Then you had 1 day off, and then you did 6 days in Evolution Valley.
That's right. Yeah.
So that's pretty.
At Evolution Lake. Well, June. So I have a deal with my wife where I get to take a number of days in June to work on the SPS list. So
is it a agreed upon number of days? Do you check them off?
It's not an agreed upon number of days, but basically June is devoted to that. And in general, I manage my co-authors, my collaborators are all aware that June is off limits.
Yeah.
And so those, and it's not really all of June. So because it typically starts on June 10 and typically ends June 25 or so. There's a couple of weeks in June.
Yeah.
Where I really try to pack it in.
They're very committed, though.
Yes, and so if you look at the whole list of trip reports, it's June heavy because it tends to be the month that I have off, and I love it because typically there's still snow on the ground. It feels much more alpine.
Do you prefer that to July, August?
Yeah, I like June. Yeah, the approaches are a bit longer if there's snow on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit less efficient, but it's more alpine, as I said. So yeah, typically that. But I would say days spent in the mountains per year is maybe 20, 25. Something. Whereas I think Alberto was more like 100 or 100. If you count the skiing and all the rest he was doing, really out there. And he was amazingly productive. He was one of the best economists of the 20th century.
Wow.
Or 21st, 20th.
Did he have a family?
Yeah, he was married. He didn't have kids, but and his wife also shared a lot of his outdoor passion. So
that helps.
Yeah, that helps. And but he was just extremely efficient with work, and he was very good at sort of thinking about new ideas. And I think the mountaineering actually and the skiing fed into that. It certainly does for me. It's part of the production of academic knowledge to be able to reflect, and step back and think maybe more deeply about ideas without being glued to a screen.
Sure.
Because what do you do when you walk for hours and hours? You think about your projects. I do at least.
Yeah, but you think at
a
different wavelength, right?
Yeah, well, it allows you to step back, I think, from, and think more broadly.
Yeah.
Obviously, you can get into the nitty gritty of an idea because you have the tools to do it.
References or places to write.
Yeah, or statistical analysis. Obviously,
Sure.
you can't do that, but you can think about the broader context. I've had multiple ideas for papers while in the mountains. And I don't see these two pursuits as incompatible with each other.
Well, it raises the question, are there any pursuits that are incompatible with a life in the outdoors?
Well, that's a great
From
question.
my position, and I don't want to apply it broadly to all of humanity, but I can't think of one. I've always held the opinion that there's no one that wouldn't be bettered within their comfort zone by spending time outside of the tight confines of society. If anything, it for a lot of people, I think it would alleviate anxiety and a false and damaging value system. It also brings them more in touch with, I think, who they are rather than who they're trying to become. It gets rid of the endless comparison that is just part and parcel of modern society. I can't imagine it being unhealthy for anyone except perhaps a few with very unusual emotional makeups that I can't speak to. But I can't imagine a pursuit that wouldn't be bettered by time in the backcountry, except perhaps being a father. Then it's about how much time in the backcountry.
Well, I completely agree. I think that it makes you a better person to be in touch with nature. It has a cost in terms of time, so it takes you away from things. So activities that involve a lot of social interactions, I don't know, running for political office, for example.
Right.
Obviously you can't do it. You can't devote substantial time to being outdoors if you're doing that. And then parenting, of course, that's a big cost, which has been an issue for me. Like, having this passion involves being away from your kids for periods of time, especially when they're little. And that is something that causes you to tamp it down. Then the great thing is you can take them. So when they're old enough.
I'm waiting.
Yeah. Oh, 8 years old, you can.
It depends on the kid, though.
Yeah.
The last thing I want to do is force my passion, or to a degree, you do want to enforce a value system, but to enforce your character on your kid, I think you're going to guarantee that the pendulum will swing and they'll rebel from it.
Yeah,
so she's done I think on this map, the green dots are the ones she's done with me, those peaks. But some of them were death marches. Yeah. Some of them were like, we're not quitting. We're not quitting. Eat your Oreos. Let's go. Yeah. And I'm afraid that if those memories outweigh the good ones, even though she's always so happy on the way down, if she only remembers the way up, it's going to be self-defeating. So I've stepped back a little bit and I've waited for her to ask.
Yeah, that's right. She needs to be in the driving seat and ask for it. But I think acclimatizing them or acculturating them to outdoor activities very early is helpful.
Yeah.
Without forcing them to do anything, but at least, putting them next to a lake. And then it comes naturally. So, but, the older kids, and my daughter is not a climber. My older daughter, who's 21 years old, is not a climber, but she's a fantastic backpacker. She's got tons of endurance, and she can go for very long days. And we do an annual trip, father-daughter, sort of, few days out in the Sierra, picking an itinerary that involves trails because she likes trails.
Yeah.
Occasionally, if it's easy cross-country terrain, I can convince her to go.
You did the High Sierra Trail with your daughter, right?
Yes, I did the High Sierra Trail with her.
I remember seeing that.
High Sierra Trail, we did big sections of the JMT, the southern section and the northern section. When we did the southern part of the JMT, we went up Mount Whitney. It was a fantastic experience because we basically spent the night at Trail Crest after climbing Whitney, and had it was after a sort of bit stormy weather, fantastic views of Guitar Lake and Mount Hitchcock from this little perch that we had at 13,000 feet. I have some photos on my website that I really cherished from that evening, with the sun setting and us, bivvying on that little, there's a couple of bivvy spots right now.
Oh, it sounds magical. Great. At least you said she's not a peak bagger, but there's something about that wild swoop in subjective perspective that you go from. This is what kind of entranced me, and it reflects what you were talking about when you get to the backcountry, you get objectivity on your pursuits, your life, your family, and in a way deepens your relationship to all of them. I felt the same with altitude. The fact that in one day you can start beneath the tree line where you feel as though the peaks are a background element to what is otherwise a lush forested range. And then when you get up to the peak, you realize, Oh, no, 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 no.
Yeah.
These lush forests are tiny dabs of color in a world of rock and ice. And that shift in perspective is such a powerful one. And it creates that plasticity of emotion and outlook that I like to believe we can then bring home and apply to other things.
Yeah. No, I agree. She likes it. I think she doesn't want to be scrambling or climbing.
Well, exposure is a different game.
Yeah. Well, she's particularly afraid of heights or anything like that, but maybe she feels that way. At any rate, I adjust to what the kids want to do. And
do you think, is there any part of you that thinks of this as an obsession rather than a passion?
Probably it's both. I think it is. It's a disease in a way, peak bagging.
I like the
it's
analogy.
It's a mental illness of sorts.
Is that specific to the fact that we now have a list and you can so fixate on this large goal?
Yeah.
I think if we didn't have that, if it was just wandering and climbing mountains as we chose, perhaps that linear obsessive quality wouldn't be activated in quite the same way.
I don't know. I think what you were describing about altitude and finding elevation and looking down,
that's
I think
hard to give up. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a feeling that's so exhilarating and great that I think that's what causes the disease to maybe it would still be there absent having the lists.
That's a good point.
List.
Do you think it's reliant on exposure and danger as well? Because that's another element that does give you a sense of empowerment and does give you this enforced objectivity.
Yeah.
You know, you might enjoy this idea. I've thought about this a lot with my own introduction to putting at times my life on the line and then saying, why I have to know this is worth it. And why is this so rewarding? And there's this idea, I think, that the confines of anything describe its shape. Without it, you don't know what the identity of an object or an idea is, and the analogies go on that an explosion requires confinement. Otherwise, the chemical reaction dissipates, right? And that also in terms of like a spiritual approach to identity, embracing our limitations as what creates us. With no limitations, we have no personality. Nothing differentiates us between any other human. So in the same way, to really appreciate your own life, approaching its edge gives you a sense of its delicacy, the finitude of its nature, and all of a sudden you have this wild appreciation, not for risking your life, but for retaining it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. There's also a sense of trying to find where your limit is in terms of, accepting danger.
But that's a dangerous game if you're always seeking the limit.
Well, it's not necessarily seeking the limit. It's being aware of where your personal limit is. I'm not, I think, it's a dangerous game to be trying to find out how far you can push it. But I think you can be aware of where your limit is without doing that.
Did you find yours? Was there a moment where you said, that's enough? I'm not going, like, this experience was unpleasant and I don't want to go any farther than this again.
Oh, there was...
Did you find a limit?
There was one moment, it was many, many years ago, and I was, my wife was teaching at UCSB at the time, and so we were based part of the time in Santa Barbara. And there's a cliff there, I actually can't remember the name now. There's a crag there that has a 5-6 route that's very, very nice. And one weekend, it was a weekday, I don't remember, I went and free soloed it. And when I finished it, when I did that and came back down, I've said to myself, never, ever again.
It was just a single pitch.
It was just a single pitch, and it went great. But it was so amazingly better than not free soloing. Oh. It was such an intense experience to me. Obviously it's not many. It's just like climbing a ladder. But to me, like, it was the first time I was free soloing 5th class.
Yeah.
That I felt that if I did it more, I would get addicted to it, and so I never free soloed 5th class
you
again.
You tasted a dangerous drug, and you didn't want any more of it.
There, I figured out that was sort of something where I was not willing to go there anymore, having tried it once.
Wow.
And so I hope that that's the case for most people, because we shouldn't be doing that.
But I like the idea that There are tangible, immediate, and powerful ramifications to every choice you make.
Yeah.
I think perhaps we seek that in daily life. We want our decisions to matter. We want a sense of importance ascribed to our otherwise mundane day-to-day activities. And then when you get it out there, it feels like, whoa, I'm alive.
Yeah.
You know?
It definitely makes you feel alive, but you can get that feeling without necessarily going beyond where you see your personal limit.
Oh, absolutely.
So that's how I feel about it. And also, I find that with aging, that frontier gets closer and closer to safety. Really, really. And also having responsibilities and kids, the consequences of something serious happening.
That's for sure.
For other people are much greater. And so, you need to have a much bigger buffer.
Yeah, the balance is between coming back as a better husband, son, father, and friend, and risking not coming back at all.
Yeah.
So those you love have a lot to gain by us doing this. I'm sure I'm a less selfish, more generous person because I go out. But if they lose me, how selfish was the whole endeavor?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's that delicate balance.
We really wrestle. I think every climber really wrestles. So I'm asked often, do you really need to do an annual solo trip?
Yes. The answer is yes.
The answer is yes. I really need to do an annual solo trip. And I think I'm doing it safely. There's objective dangers, of course. I could break my leg or...
Yeah, but you've got a satellite... You have a satellite communicator. Are you doing fourth class solo? Or just third class?
No, I'll go up to third class, but not B.
I mean, I only do second, but it sounds reasonable.
Those boundaries are very...
I know.
Subjective.
Third class becomes fourth class. Yeah. I did Pinchot and the Pinchot wind traverse.
Yes.
Forget the traverse though. Yeah. We did Pinchot with no research, no track downloaded. Mm-hmm. We just knew we're going to go up what face was it? The west face, the face of the JMT. I'm turned around. I think it's the west face, but we didn't know what the entry point was. We ended up going right along the north edge of the west face, and it's a broad face. Yeah. In the end, we should have gone up the southern edge. So we had to traverse ridge and gully on really loose, steep terrain to finally pop out the south face and make the summit. Yeah. And that was supposed to be third class, and it was like multiple stretches of fourth class. Yeah. And then the traverse was terrifying. Part of it might be because I'm not as tall, because there was some down climbing on really loose rock.
Yeah, you're down climbing in that direction. I think it's much easier going from wind to Pinchot.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
And we did Pinchot wind, and at some point you can't continue along the knife edge. You have to choose a side, and so you have to down climb to the slope. And I remember that was unpleasant. Yeah. That was scary. Yeah, because I didn't know where my foot was going. I wasn't tall enough.
I recommend doing it in the other direction.
Well, I'm not doing it. How about I recommend never doing it again? How's that?
Yeah.
But that was exciting.
It's a nice route, though. It's a nice, rich trip.
Having done it, I can't imagine going up Pinchot, coming down, going up wind, coming down. I feel as though the experience needs to be had. Yeah. Because now you've really been somewhere. Yeah. But again, it's this subjective rush of having gotten away unscathed. And, it's like the Greek myth of you stealing fire from the gods. We get to bring it back.
Yeah. I mean, in a case like this, there was you didn't really know what was in store, and it was fourth class, and you didn't have ropes. And maybe if you had one, you would have taken it.
Maybe. I don't know.
Sometimes it doesn't help on fourth class, depending on how it's
Well, the rock was so bad.
Yeah.
What anchor would you build?
Yeah. It might actually be more dangerous.
It could be.
I can see myself doing that, and it has happened.
But you never look at it from the bird's eye perspective. You just look at the next section. So you're not, at least my experience is, you're not thinking about how deep you're getting. Yeah. Obviously, in the back of your mind, you're always sure you can reverse your tracks. But it's always just, well, can I make it up that ledge to see what's around the corner? And then once you're there, you say, well, can I make it over this small boulder, this little move? And if you break it down piece by piece, you end up taking on challenges that you would never take on if they were laid out in entirety.
But when you're standing at the base of the route and looking up, you have to ask yourself, is it my day? I'm looking at the whole thing.
So that's purely...
Is it the right thing to do today?
But that's purely emotional, to me that
I would go, for example, with Renee, who was my longest climbing partner. We had a day where we were going to climb the Starlight Buttress on Starlight Peak, Palisades. And we had already done we'd done Mount Winchell the day before, and it was June, so pretty snowy. We got to the base of it, and we looked up, and it was clear it was not going to happen that day.
Why is that? Weather or just your feeling?
Just we just looked at it, and we had all the equipment, we had everything, and we'd been climbing for many, many years, and it was just not we had this bad feeling, and we ended up not doing it and going to climb another peak nearby instead. And we had a great day in the mountains, and we hadn't climbed Starlight Buttress, and that's okay.
Oh, interesting.
Came back later. And
have you had that feeling before, or was that the one and only time?
No, it happens from time to time. I get to the base and I feel like I'm taking an undue risk today, and it's just not the right time. And I follow my instinct. And I think, knock on wood, but it's the right thing to do.
But that's not saying this route is too dangerous. You're just saying today's not
the right day. I'm not in the right frame of mind for it. And no, the route wasn't actually, the route is great. The Starlight Buttress is great. I ended up going with another partner a couple of years later and doing it. The descent, because it involves rappelling the whole route, is quite nerve-wracking. Mm-hmm. 12 rappels in the mountains. But it's just the frame of mind in which you are. You've got different tolerance. There's days where it flows beautifully and,
Well, what concerns me, I heard someone once say, I don't remember whom, but this idea that some days you just feel ready to take on the challenge and some days you don't can be interpreted as some days you just don't care as much about the repercussions.
Yeah.
And maybe that's still important, that if you're in the right mental state, you're more likely to succeed. But it is concerning that there are other times where whatever part of the brain is just doing proper risk assessment, it's a little less engaged. So you're just very excited. And today's my day.
But then what comes with that, I think, is more control, better flow,
it's true.
And a better day. And if you start out, maybe tired, in a bad mood, maybe your mental faculties.
That's fair.
I've had days where it all came together beautifully and end up having a real sense of mastery at the end of the day, even if it's not something that by mountaineering standards is very hard, mm-hmm. but it's something where you feel by your own standards, and that's great. And I think the upside of that is much greater than the downside of giving up on a peak because you really don't feel like it that day.
Have you had any physical breakdown in these long trips in the mountains when you're doing huge miles? It seems like your body holds up incredibly well based on the trip reports. I mean, have you always been athletic? Do you intentionally train when you're not out there? Or do you have times where you just completely burn out and you just can't put in the miles and you're achy in the morning? It doesn't seem like you've encountered a lot of that.
Not that I can remember. I definitely intentionally train for it. I run during the year. Yeah. Initially, the running was very instrumental. It was so I could be in shape for mountaineering in the summer. And then it, of course, took a life of its own. Now I like running for the sake of running.
As obsession does everywhere.
I can't think of that. I mean, there have been trips where, I set out. That's very common. You plan to climb 6 peaks, and then after the 4th peak, you're like, okay, enough. Let's go home. That happens. Yeah.
Ready for a shower.
Yeah.
Hot food. Well, I think we have a really good sense of your life in the mountains. I want to transition a little because, again, like I said, part of what really interested me about you was this Clark Kent, Superman dichotomy, or to be less forgiving, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, that you have these two lives. You told me when we met at the SPS banquet last year, I think you told me that none or very few of your colleagues know you even have this side to your life. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think I try to keep it separate. I'm worried about how it will affect my academic reputation if it comes out
how do you
too
imagine
broadly
it would?
that I'm a mountaineer, because it's a big time commitment.
Is there an expectation that 24/7 you're researching and publishing, which, by the way, from your prolific output, it kind of seems like you are?
Among academics, especially academic economists, there is a little bit of that expectation.
Really?
Yes.
You have to live and breathe it?
You have to live and breathe it. It's
like being a physicist.
I think it was quite well known that Alberto, my thesis advisor, was a top skier, mm-hmm. but it was never sort of something that was part of his public persona. I'm trying to keep it that way too. So, for example, my professional website is not connected to my climbing trip reports because I don't want that to be mixed together. So they're different.
But does it take a concerted effort just in casual conversation to not mention something that's such a big part of your life?
Well, it depends who. So with very close colleagues, they all know.
Right.
It's not something I hide either.
But do you find in general among academics or academic economists specifically, there's less of this tendency to have a life outside of your study as well?
Well, I think a lot of academic economists in particular tend to hide whatever life they have outside of their study.
See, that's too bad. So there's the social expectation that we compartmentalize this.
Of the very unusual personality of economists.
How would you describe that?
Oh, well, the economic way of thinking is fairly cold-hearted we call it the dismal science.
Isn't it similar to being a mathematician? That's how I'd imagine the archetypal personality. Worse? How so?
Well, the mathematician doesn't have to have a philosophy of human behavior, but economists do.
But that would make you more relatable and empathetic, not less.
Well, no, because the nature of the philosophy is extremely sort of, it's a bit of a caricature. I think it's changed a lot now in economics. It was, that humans are very self-centered. They pursue their own goals. They are maximizers, so they're calculating. So it's a view of human nature that's quite
mechanical.
Yeah, mechanical, quite cold, data-driven, rational.
Because if you can't reduce humanity to quantifiable elements, you're out of a job.
Yeah, in many ways you are. The whole business proposition of economics has been to quantify things,
right?
And the conclusions you can derive from them. And so that's what makes economics admirable, but it also makes it a little bit cold.
Yeah, but I find your work seems to be pushing that boundary even more in terms of less of the cold, calculated viewing humanity as a predictable set of mechanisms and more trying to dig into sociological, even psychological aspects. I mean, I read a bunch of the abstracts and I found them fascinating. And I think a lot of people who aren't familiar with academia or economics in the university setting or economics at all might think of like Smith and Keynesian economics. And to me, this is dry as a sandbox. And then I looked at your stuff and I said that I thought this was anthropology. This looks like history. This is fascinating. You had one paper called, do you mind if we touch into these and talk about them?
Happy to.
Because even though I'm relatively uninformed, my college career consisted of a single quarter and then dropping out to become a musician. So that's the experience that I'm coming to the table with. But you had one paper on the measurement of social heterogeneity.
Yeah.
But this was so cool. You were setting out to measure the social utility of interactions between individuals based on their socio-psychological similarity.
Yes.
So meaning we're trying to define based on common backgrounds, upbringings, and culture, whether they have a subjective sense of antagonism when interacting or of harmony.
Yeah.
Now, on the surface, this would seem completely unquantifiable. This would seem beyond subjective. So how do you take something that's this amorphous and give it a backbone of mathematics?
But it's very tricky, and the way people used to do the measure, so let's back up a little bit. So basically, if you have a society where people don't disagree, there's no need for politics. Okay, so imagine a society where everybody agrees on everything.
It's a utopia.
And they're all the same. I'm not sure it would be such a great utopia to be in a society with no diversity whatsoever.
Right.
But there would certainly not be a political problem. You wouldn't need to have voting to resolve differences because there would be no differences. And so the reason we're interested in measuring differences and measuring heterogeneity, what we call heterogeneity, so differences between individuals, is because it's the building block of of politics, really. And also distribution. So if you think about distributional struggle, who gets resources and who doesn't, that's based on differences.
Mm-hmm.
So we're interested in measuring social heterogeneity because we want to track how this social heterogeneity translates into different political economy outcomes. We're interested in knowing, for example, are societies that are very ethnically divided, do you tend to see more conflict, civil wars, because ethnicities disagree with each other and might go to war, which is something that's very prevalent right now in sub-Saharan Africa, ethnic conflict. Or you might be interested in, if people disagree about social issues, let's say things like the rate of taxation or how much the state should redistribute. How does that impact the voting and then ultimately whether society redistributes or not? And so we're interested in measuring social heterogeneity in order to predict or to try to better understand how political processes work.
But how do you do that? How do you build a data set? How do you,
Well, so that's extremely tricky, even if you think of things that are obvious. Like, for example, you might think religious conflict is important, so let me just ask people what religion they have. And then if there are lots of people with different religions, I'm going to conclude that this society is very different on a religious basis. But it's much more complicated than that because, the degree of religious diversity might depend on many other things that vary across societies. For example, some societies are theocracies, and having a different religion than the official one is not accepted. And so even though you might want to have a different religion, you're not going to.
You're not permitted.
You're not permitted to, and you're not going to say that you have one if you do, or if you have a different belief system. And so even in the simple cases where you can identify the dimension along which people differ, be it ethnicity or religion, it's hard sometimes to measure. Even things as obvious and observable as skin color, are actually a lot more tricky than you think, because people with different skin colors, might report being of a different race,
right?
And so you see that.
Or in certain environments, there might be more harmony between disparate races, and in others, they define a schism that can't be bridged.
Yes, I mean you can imagine different kinds of measurements. So one thing is, what do we differ? How do we differ? Mm-hmm. Along what dimension do we differ? And that's one of the topics that this paper, considers. And in particular, in recent years, there's been more of a tendency to ask people not how they differ in terms of their identity, be it racial or religious or linguistic, but more sort of how they differ in terms of their beliefs. So we've seen repeatedly that people of a given race might disagree a ton on what their beliefs are, and similarly, people of different races might actually agree a lot on basic social issues. And we very often tend to overemphasize the degree of belief homogeneity of different groups. So, for example, in the recent election, the idea that Hispanics or African Americans were going to vote solidly in bloc for the Democrats.
It was assumed so.
It was assumed so, and it had been assumed so by many observers in the past. There was a book, by John Judas and Rui Teixeira called The Coming Democratic Majority, observing that because of the rise of the voting power of minority groups, that the Democrats had the wind in their sails. Mm-hmm. Well, it turns out that minority groups aren't, homogeneous in terms of how they vote and what they believe. And so that turned out to be, sort of a much more complicated story. So then let's go and ask people directly what they believe and try to measure social heterogeneity that way. And that's something I've done in a number of papers. And then the second question is, beyond deciding what separates us, is, once you know what separates us, how do you actually measure the differences? You can think of very different ways of measuring it. For example, if two groups have very different opinions, they're going to be very polarized. They're going to be fairly homogeneous within the groups. If they're very homogeneous within the groups, but the two groups are very different, you're going to have a lot of social polarization. And that's one thing. But you could also imagine everyone in the two groups having different opinions. And that's a very diverse set of groups, but they're not polarized anymore. They all have, they're extremely fractionalized in a way, but not polarized. So you can think of different ways to capture the relevant dimensions by which we differ. And so you might think, for example, polarization might matter a lot for things like civil conflict. If I have a tiny, tiny group that holds different values from all the other tiny, tiny groups in society, it might not be worth it to go to war. Because I'm a tiny, tiny minority, I'm going to lose, But if there are two groups that are loggerheads and they each have very different values, then, you might see more conflict in a case where it's polarized relative to a case where it's very diverse but not polarized.
Well, so the whole thesis assumes that diversity of opinion and culture will result in heightened conflict.
Well,
right?
It doesn't assume it. This is just the example I took, but there are many instances in which, in fact, the effect is the opposite. For example, if you think about productive teams, we have, especially at the level of, say, research and development organizations, or even there's some evidence from sports that more diverse teams tend to have higher performance in soccer, for example.
Oh, interesting.
There's different interpretations of that.
Socially diverse, culturally diverse, you mean?
Yeah, in terms of national origin, for example. The reason is typically, I think my interpretation of it is, it's not really diversity per se. It's that teams that fish in the worldwide pool of talent tend to get better talent. And if you limit yourself to, picking players from a restricted pool, you're going to do worse because you're not going to get.
That's very logical.
But it is diversity, in a sense that gives you the better outcomes. And but in terms of productivity, having people who think differently, if you're looking for new ideas in terms of developing new research ideas, if you have people who think very differently, you're more likely to stumble upon something really novel than if you have a homogeneous team So by no means is it an intended implication that diversity necessarily leads to conflict or bad outcomes. I think it depends a lot on the context. It's not the case either that diversity is a panacea that always leads to better outcomes. I think that's what makes this research question so interesting. It's not a black and white.
No. And doesn't it define antagonism as a sense of alienation? Wasn't that a key term in terms of how to define negative social utility between the interactions of individuals?
It does, but that's more sort of a device to get to measures.
Yeah.
So we construct measures based on the assumption that if you differ from me, we're not going to have as much in common, and we're going to be
we'll feel not understood and isolated, etc.
But in the end, once you have the measures, they could very well predict that you and I get along better because we're different, because we now have a broader set of things to talk about, for example. The whole paper is sort of agnostic on the effects of diversity. It's an empirical question. Let's first measure it, capture it. It's really a paper about measurement.
But then you'd hope there's a practical application.
Definitely. And then the next step is to look for the effects of diversity. That's where the third part of the paper
Didn't you have another paper much earlier called The Cultural Divide that did exactly that? It was,
yes.
Right?
So
the two could work in tandem, in theory, to predict conflict in a society.
That paper was more sort of descriptive. The Cultural Divide was looking at the U.S. And people are saying that the U.S. is more divided than it was in the past. And how can you find out if it's true? Well, just ask people what they believe about stuff, and then look at whether groups differ more today than they did in the past. And it turns out we have a wonderful survey in the U.S. called the General Social Survey, where basically the poll asked people the same questions over time since 1972. So they asked questions about abortion, about gay rights, about preferences for redistribution, attitudes toward immigrants, notions of nationalism, things like that. And then they're the same questions every 2 years, roughly speaking, since 1972. So we have a long time series of what people believe, and we observe other things about them. If they're men, women, black, white, immigrants, not immigrants, from rural areas, from urban areas, are they Republicans, Democrats? And so we did the systematic investigation of whether cultural divides had deepened.
But that was divorced from this homogeneity of culture that we discussed, right?
It was trying to measure this homogeneity and then ask, has it gone up or down? But it wasn't asking, is it good or bad?
Right.
What happened? And what we found was very contrasted. So it really depends on what questions you look at and what dimensions of differences, identity differences you look at. For example, men and women, if anything, agree much more on social issues today than they ever did in the past. And in addition to that, the cultural divide between men and women is extremely small. There's very few questions on which there's a systematic between-group division. And very surprisingly to us, the same thing holds for racial divisions. So it's a relatively small division. The big divisions in the US are between political groups, and that has increased dramatically. So Republicans and Democrats used to agree a lot more on social issues.
Now it's totally polarized.
Yes. Yeah. Used to have a lot of sort of pro-choice Republicans and pro-life Democrats, and those have sort of, they still exist, but they're much less frequent, much less prevalent. And then the other dimension is religion, in which the big story of the last 20 or so years has been the rise of people who say they have no religion. And they hold very different values from those who are still religious. So the sort of secular versus religious divide has really deepened in the US, largely not because of the types of beliefs that secular people hold, but just because there are many, many more secular people than there used to be.
Is there an age demographic typically associated with that? I'd imagine it'd be a younger one.
Yeah, it's younger. It tends to be more urban. It tends to be associated with, a lot of the nuns, as we call them, NONES, are people who say no religion, none.
Oh, I see. The other nun.
Not NUN, tend to be Democrats. And
right.
So the striking fact is that, the Democratic Party platform no longer mentions the word God. And it used to be. It did, And so you've seen a religious divide that partly overlaps with the political divide.
I'd imagine so, because, the nuns, as you call them, I would think just statistically, that's associated more with left-wing ideology, because conservative so-called family values have now been attached to right-wing ideology. And I'd also imagine that it goes hand in hand with lower fertility rates because you're not seeing traditional families in the same manner amongst that demographic.
Yeah, I mean,
draw from that what you will, but I just think statistically those things hold true.
Definitely the association between secularism and political orientation. I'm less sure about the fertility part because I think the decline in fertility has also affected fairly religious communities. Not the very smallest ones that you might think of, like, the
Amish or
the Anabaptists, the Hutterites, all of that. The other, but the broader story about the fertility decline, which is also something I've worked on.
I know you've done a ton of papers on it. I wanted to talk to you about that.
Yeah, so those things I think are more universal and have affected both the people who have no religion and those who are.
Although, my wife is Quebecois, and she talks about how, at least from her point of view and her parents' point of view, there's a very distinct connection between the loss of deep Catholicism in Quebec and the disappearance of these enormous families. Yeah. I mean, I think her father was one of 6, her mother's one of 8, and that was commonplace. And now she was an only child, maybe for other reasons, but she said that was very common. Yeah. So that may be too small of a sample size to judge based on, but I think there must be a connection there.
Oh, there's definitely a connection. I didn't mean to say there was no connection. I think there's a connection between religion and fertility, definitely. But I think it's perhaps more complicated than just to say the decline in fertility is attributable to the rise of secularism.
Right.
It goes well beyond that, even within religious families.
No, that's true, because you had papers that connected it to genetic distance, which is the amount of years between generations. You had it to proximity to cultural hubs. And my personal favorite, proximity to French-speaking societies, which is the most French thing ever to say, like, well, we're the fountainhead of modernism. And if they're close to French, then there's going to...
So the French were not the fountainhead of modernism along all dimensions.
No, but the French think so.
Well, of course, but they're wrong. I mean, I can say this because I'm French. The French didn't invent, for example, one of the main manifestation of modernity, which is the Industrial Revolution. Like, that was England. Right. And even if you take a look at things like the emphasis on the accumulation of knowledge and human capital, basically education, it was more of a German invention. So different European societies have had different contributions to European modernization. The English brought industry and industrialization. The Germans, you could say, painting with a broad brush, brought education and valuing the accumulation of knowledge. And the contribution of the French was to bring the fertility transition.
Cynicism. Oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah, it was. Well, there's that too. Yes, but the French were the first society in Europe by far of many generations to start having fewer babies, and that was in the mid 18th century. The rest of Europe didn't transition to modern birth rates until the end of the 19th century, so more than 100 years later.
Isn't this already a historical inversion, that we're talking about lower fertility rates as a sign of affluence and modernity, whereas historically, wouldn't lower fertility rates be associated with deprivation and decline?
Absolutely.
Right?
In fact, in Malthusian times, the richer you were, the more babies you had, because there was an income effect.
That was that bust-boom cycle that I think you wrote another paper that disproved. You wrote a paper talking about how migration was the mitigating factor to Malthusian theory, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the idea that as a society becomes more affluent, their population will swell until the population pretty much negates the affluence, and we have the bust-boom cycle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that was the story. I don't negate that story as a description of history up to the time of when Thomas Malthus was writing. Thomas Malthus was a great economist who was much, criticized today because modernity seems to have killed Malthusian ideas, but he was right for most of human history.
Right, up to his point, he was correct.
Up to his point, he was correct. Every time you had a big technological improvement, say, that raised the yields in the farms, instead of raising the level of income of each person, you had more people. Mm-hmm. And so that, as you said, extra wealth was dissipated among a bigger population, which is why the historically most technologically advanced societies tend to have the biggest populations today. But what changed in the 19th century were two things. First, you had a gradual accumulation of knowledge that allowed European societies to transition to a different model of growth, in which whenever you had a technological innovation, you didn't necessarily end up having more kids. So you escaped that Malthusian trap. And the other way you could escape the Malthusian trap beyond, sufficiently fast technological progress was to leave. So even if you had more kids, you had this huge territory that you could then leave, go to, and where the return to labor would never decline because there was so much land and an endless frontier, and that was the New World. Of course, the U.S. was the prime destination for many of the Northern Europeans and Italians, and then Latin America more for Spanish-speaking Europeans and also Italians for Argentina, for example. But basically, the New World was this sort of escape valve where you could have, technological progress in Europe that led to more kids, but those kids wouldn't stay in Europe, and so you could actually elevate per capita. The reason the French were important is the French escaped the Malthusian curse earlier than everyone else because for some reason that is still debated and has something to do with secularization in France also, and the sort of philosophy that came out of the Age of Enlightenment in France. Ended up having this fertility transition in the 18th century. So while France didn't industrialize, people had fewer babies. And so the French became, if you look at England and France in the early 20th century, they had per capita incomes that were very comparable, but they got there very differently.
Yeah.
The French got there by having fewer babies, and the English got there by growing the size of GDP through industrialization.
Right. One did by having more, one did by needing less.
Yeah, you could say that. It was basically, if you think of per capita GDP as GDP divided by the number of people.
Exactly.
France worked on the number of people, and England worked on GDP. So, and they ended up in the same place in terms of. So we estimate in the paper that if France had not had its fertility transition when it did, but instead had a transition to lower fertility at the same time as England, which is in the late 19th century.
Yeah.
There would be 200 million French people now instead of 58 or 65 million.
So the landscape of the country would be completely different.
It'd be just as dense as the Netherlands.
Right.
And the other thing that would have happened in France is you would have a huge diaspora, because if the French had a late fertility transition, they would have sent a lot more migrants abroad, and you would have about 300 million people descended from French people living all over the New World.
So this fertility transition, which means a decline in fertility in a relatively affluent country, while obviously socially you could promulgate the culture of a country by raising fertility, I'd imagine economically it benefits a country to see a fertility decline. Is that correct?
Well, it benefits it in terms of the welfare of each individual, because it prevents this Malthusian curse from occurring and everyone ending up back at, close to the level of subsistence, which is the typical Malthusian curse that he thought was inescapable. So yes, I think by and large, one of the greatest achievements of humanity in recent centuries has been to escape the Malthusian curse and enter what we call modern growth, where you can actually grow people's individual level of welfare as opposed to growing the number of people in society. But it has its limits. And we're seeing those limits now, because as soon as you fall below the level of replacement and you start having so few kids that now you have a very pronounced problem with aging of the population, then you've overshot in many ways.
Is it China who has the worst situation right now in that regard?
Well, Korea has the lowest, South Korea now has the lowest recorded fertility rate of any society in history.
Wow.
And they're around 0.7 child per woman, which is, replacement is 2.1. So they're 3 times, they need to triple their fertility rate to get to replacement. And so these societies are going to face, it depends who you ask, but I think these societies are going to face very severe challenges in particular in financing their welfare states, because the working age population is going to be a much smaller share of the overall population as more and more people retire and become older. Now, some economists have started to think about AI and automation as a way to escape this curse, because now we will have machines producing GDP.
Everyone's touting AI as the solution to all of our.
There's this, and also, the ability of people to work later in life and be more productive, because we will not only extend lifespans, but hopefully with new technologies, we will also extend the number of years in which you have a productive life and enjoyable life.
You mean you're shortening retirement? That's what we're saying.
Yeah, you're shortening retirement, but you're also extending not just the number of years that you live, but the quality of those years.
Health span instead of lifespan, as we say. Yeah.
And so it'll be fine to be working when you're 70 if if you look like a 50-year-old.
We have so much to look forward to.
I don't know. I don't know if it's us. I think it's the next generation.
No, it certainly.
But the challenges of aging are going to be quite profound, and there's going to be challenges also with how to deal with automation. Right now, the model we have is whoever owns the machines gets the income. Mm-hmm. But that's not sustainable if most of the income is produced by machines and not humans, because then what are most of the humans going to earn? So we have to change our models of how rewards are distributed in society.
Yeah, we'll skew toward a more socialist landscape, I'd imagine.
Well, that's not the direction we're taking. There's two solutions. One would be to redistribute from the owners of the machines to those who don't own machines, which has been the socialist sort of prescription. And that certainly is going to be part of it. Welfare states, it's essentially what welfare states do. But another is to make the ownership of capital more broad. And that has also happened. So you have a lot of retirees have very large retirement accounts, that they've accumulating during their working life. And if everyone has a claim to the income generated by robots and AI, then that capital income essentially is going to replace labor income. And I think that's a much more promising avenue than redistribution, because the politics of redistribution are very difficult. But if you have an ownership society in which people own, claims on the means of production, basically if you democratize the ownership of capital, then there's no real issue. You get the return from that capital by virtue of owning it.
But this is a shift away from traditional capitalism, isn't it?
Well, it means that the ownership of capital is less concentrated, but I'm not sure it's a shift away from the principle of, accumulation of capital is a good thing.
Right. But how do you achieve this huge transition in ownership?
Well, that's very complicated. Some people think you might need, more wealth taxation and redistribution of wealth.
Right.
But what I tell my students is, own capital. The future belongs not to those who have labor, but those who have capital. If you believe that, and that's also debated, that machines will replace us, it will be more true in certain sectors than others. What you're seeing now is not really playing out on the labor market.
No.
Well, if you take a span of 40 years, yes. But if you take a span of the last 10 or 15 years, the really bottom of the labor market has been the tightest. So finding waiters, finding people who do construction jobs, those have been, hard to replace by machines so far.
But the integration of these new technologies is occurring at an exponential rate. Yeah. So I think the last 4 years are probably more representative than the last 15, don't you?
Yeah, but then if you think that, then you might think that waiters and construction workers will also be replaced by robots.
Within the realm of possibility.
But it hasn't played out yet.
No.
I'm on the side of those who think that ultimately machines will be able to do most tasks. I think in agreement with what you just said about the pace of technology.
Yeah.
But it raises really profound issues, how you're going to earn a crust.
It does. And that's interesting because a lot of your work has been divorced from either this futurist projection or any ethical concerns, right? You're just trying to quantify the nearly unquantifiable. But at least I sense that at no point in the academic work do you address maybe these ethical concerns as to what does this mean for humanity looking forward, or what did it mean in the past? There's not that kind of judgment drawn.
Yeah, I think because my work tends to be positive as opposed to normative. So I'm not really, the reason I study economics is ultimately because I'm interested in policy. But I think most of my papers have been more descriptive and more trying to say, let's understand how the world works.
Exactly.
So I agree with that. But that being said, in my teaching, I do more of that. And I have a class called Global Trends where about a third of the class is devoted to wrestling precisely with this idea. And because my students are MBA students, they tend to be very interested in the tech sector, and they're very attuned to the new developments, in AI, automation, and so on. But less so, they're less sensitive to what the social consequences of that may be. I try to bring that in, and say this has profound effects on inequality, the ability of people to earn, living, and we have to think about these things. So it's a complicated story. Our demographic trends suggest that it will be a good thing to have automation because we will have fewer people of working age. But then it raises the challenge of how are the gains from, economic activity going to be distributed? It's something people are thinking of. There have been proposals for universal basic income, for example.
Right.
There have been proposals for redistributing income from owners of capital to owners of labor. There have been proposals to endow people with some amount of capital so that they can themselves become owners of machines.
All these are secondary to the inescapable forward momentum of technological progress. At no point are we saying, let's take a second look at these things because we may want to check them. Because the last guest I had on, he's a computer vision and AI expert. And I asked him the same thing. I said, do you think it's within our capabilities, policy or otherwise? Is it within the scope of human potential to say no to any technological progress?
Well, there have been historical movements like the Luddites that
yes, but they didn't
tried to slow down.
But it wasn't effective.
It wasn't effective, and it often backfires.
Right.
So there are proposals currently, to tax robots. Some people have proposed this. There are more realistic proposals to try to influence the direction of technological change in a way that is less favorable to the owners of capital and perhaps more favorable to laborers. The more sort of populist proposals to tax robots, I think, are going nowhere politically. And I agree that cat's out of the bag. You're not going to put it back in the bag.
Yeah.
There have been proposals to put a 6-month moratorium on the development of AI. That,
What does that do? Just a 7th inning stretch? We all catch our breath and
try to catch our breath and see if we can put in place policy safeguards to prevent.
But right now
they're
describing it quite literally as a race. So
exactly.
any moratorium will just give the advantage to whoever refuses to concede.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
so
that's silly.
I completely agree. This was going nowhere. And in fact, some of the people who signed on to this also signed on yesterday to the investment, $500 billion into the development of Stargate. And so,
yeah.
It's not happening.
No.
But it really poses profound challenges.
Yeah.
My research hasn't really dealt with those. It's more backward looking.
Well, I wasn't claiming that there was any onus on you to do so.
Well, there's an onus on economists to deal with issues of contemporary relevance. I think that's...
What you're doing.
Well, more or less. I think, some people tend to pursue more their intellectual interests and others more sensitive to the sense of urgency of current things. But, there's enough to go.
Well, that leads me to one other question. I think this conversation has given anyone listening a sense of how forward-thinking, but also broad and wide-reaching the scope of your research has been. And I was curious, there's no market demand for these answers. I don't know that they're not solving a pre-existing problem. How are you coming up with these topics? I know you were part of the Hoover think tank, right? And this kind of speaks to what I'd imagine that exploratory spirit. Are you sitting around with fellow researchers and really whatever tickles your fancy, you say, let's dig into that and let's research it and let's accrue funds so that we can do so? Or is there a problem being posed from an external source, then you're now the man to come up with the answer?
No, it's the first. I'm very lucky that, I had a smooth path to my research career and tenure, and I'm very fortunate to be completely free to choose whatever topic I have. And so there's almost no external influence.
Wow.
There's external influence in the sense of, academic predecessors and particularly my thesis advisor. The more recent work I've done on fertility and on historical transition, it was sort of a coincidence why I got interested in that, but it's not something he had done a lot of work on. But I do think it has contemporary relevance. So, for example, if you think about the paper on fertility and migration, predicting migration patterns based on when you had your fertility transition, it has profound implications for today. So, you think about migration out of China or out of Korea or out of even India, which is now approaching replacement rates in terms of fertility rates. You should expect those migrations to drop
yeah.
as these countries
the U.S. also
transition. Well, the U.S. Then these countries then not only should their out-migration rates drop, but they should become lands of immigration, which the U.S. has always been, but it should be even more now that its fertility rate is falling. And so that is definitely directly relevant to what's going on right now, because at the same time as we need more migrants, we have this sort of populist reaction against immigration, and electorates are rebelling against it, partly because I think they're worried about cultural dilution and loss of their cultural identity. and also less, defensible reasons, but xenophobia and racism, etc. But it's definitely relevant today. So, what are the places in the world that have the highest levels of fertility still today? Mostly sub-Saharan Africa. Niger is the country with the highest fertility rate still today in the world. Do you know
offhand what it is?
Well, it's between 6 and 7 children per woman.
That's incredible.
And these are countries that typically, haven't been sending lots of immigrants abroad because the costs of migration were high. They were very, very poor countries. And so overcoming that barrier, actually migrating out was overwhelming. Because as they develop and still retain this demographic momentum, see more migrants come out of some of these high fertility countries. We have a part of the paper that looks at that in particular. And fewer from China, fewer from countries that have experienced severe declines in fertility. These countries, which traditionally have not been lands of immigration, there's very little immigration into China, might become lands of immigration. Might see lots of Africans moving to China because they'll need the labor, and so it'll be high return labor.
I want to see what kind of food results from an African influx into China.
Very interesting indeed. The whole issue of cultural diffusion through migration is fascinating.
It's clear that you're as passionate about this stuff as you are about the mountains, that they do feed each other. You said that when you're in the mountains, very often you'll be thinking about these economic, sociological, anthropological interests.
Yep.
Does the reverse happen as well? Do you find yourself daydreaming about the mountains when you're deep in research?
I would be lying if I said I didn't.
Yeah.
No, I mean, there's a life cycle to it. So the fall and winter are always the most busy seasons for research. And of course, mountains have died down by then. And so when the spring starts to approach and I'm thinking ahead of my June trips, et cetera, the most common window that's open on my desktop tends to be, the topo, super topo, or the Cal Topo, the maps of where I'm going to go, and all the trip reports of those things. So yeah, I mean, definitely there's a time where it ramps up around February, March, when you start to think about.
Would you encourage your students to cultivate a dual parallel interest that has nothing to do with their studies? Or do you think this is just something specific to your nature and your upbringing?
No, I would encourage them to do it. I think everyone needs balance in life. You can't.
Well, obsession encourages quite the opposite.
But it's an obsession that stays in check, right? You can't be. I mean, I wouldn't certainly.
You can't see a version of yourself that goes out there way too often and you're barely coming back. I certainly can. And the same for other things.
It, I think.
I could also imagine, I'm a writer as well as a mountaineer, and I could very often when I'm deep into a project, I won't even go hiking. Weeks will go by, and I'll just forget about it. And at some point, I'll have to tell myself, "Hey, you've got this other thing that's important to you." So,
but you will do it. You will go back to it. And so I think we advocate the same thing. I think.
Or maybe having competing
you spread
obsessions.
It through time, you have competing obsessions.
Yeah,
exactly.
And then they balance each other. Yeah. Then you don't lose yourself completely.
Exactly. Because that's how I think of it. Like I would not like to stop doing research. Sometimes I feel like, should I become a full-time mountaineer? Could I retire? Probably could. At some point, I'm 55 years old. It could be within 5 years. And you're still, able to go into the mountains at 60. But I don't want to. I think you would end up being sort of intellectually deprived of challenges, and it needs to be both. Yeah. And there needs to be a balance. And the other consideration is these are not the only dimensions of life. There's also family. That's very, very important to me. The most important. So you can't just, you have to balance more than these two things.
That's a good point. 3 things. Yeah, it's a trifecta.
At least 3 things.
At least 3. Yeah. The multifaceted human.
Yeah.
It's fascinating stuff, Roman. I really appreciate you sitting down, talking to us about all this.
Thanks.
I mean, for me, it was very enlightening. I appreciate it.
It was for me too. Thanks.
That's it for this go-around. Thank you so much, as always, for joining me. And if you're enjoying the show, please spread the word. And come join me on Patreon, where you can support the show, but also can get a ton of totally free bonus material as well. No need to dish out the shekels. There's a bunch of extra footage with Roman that I'll be releasing, as well as some with last week's episode guest, Robert Lundquist. The Patreon link is in the show notes. and I'll see you next time.